Welcome into episode 37 of the Josh Hendrickson Show. I'm Neil McCready, joined, as you might expect, by Josh Hendrickson, Chair of Economics at the University of Mississippi, here on this Wednesday, February the 26th. Josh, how are you?
Doing well.
It's been 3 weeks since we last talked. Might be 3 weeks before we go again. So a lot to get to. A lot of things have happened. Most importantly, Jake Tapper's come out with a book. I'm excited. Finally, Jake Tapper feels like he's sourced to write about the end of the Biden administration and the great original lie of the former president not exactly being with all of his faculties while he was in the White House. It's an interesting juxtaposition to his stance less than a year ago when he didn't feel confident writing this book, and he was pretty emphatic that the former vice president and then current president was sharper than ever before.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting, things happen, things change. I tell people all the time, things are fluid. What is true on Monday is not necessarily true on Tuesday. And I'm sure that what happened is that Tapper stumbled upon some information and it's changed his worldview.
It's really remarkable. These people are completely shameless. Imagine going on television for years, and saying, there's nothing wrong with Joe Biden. Everybody says that Joe Biden is fine. To within weeks of him leaving the White House, publishing
literally
a book.
A month and 6 days.
Publishing a book. On how they covered up all of his health issues and how he never, and his attempt to run again despite these health issues and all these kinds of things. Like, just imagine how shameless you have to be to spend years saying this isn't happening and then to publish a book about it. Because think about it. The book is being published now. Okay, so it wasn't written last week. It wasn't written last month. It takes a long time to write a book. And so this...
Yes, and to publish the book and all
Right.
of those things. It's not an overnight process.
And so the idea that, like, for years, he's just like, no, this is not happening. How can you say that? There's no evidence of this. And then immediately publish a book. Like, the shamelessness of these people is remarkable.
Tapper's now publishing a book, quote, exposing the cover-up of Joe Biden's mental decline. It's called Original Sin.
The call was coming from inside the house.
Who
was engaged in this cover-up, do you think? Who participated?
Tapper, the leader of the cover-up, is now exposing the cover-up. It's fascinating. Original Sin. You can, if you're all rushing to pre-order, I can get you a link. Jake and his big book. All right, I asked for questions today and got plenty. So let's pull that up. Appreciate everyone who participated. Peter Vinkman wants to know, Josh, what do you think about the 5,000 Doge dividend refund that Elon Musk has proposed? Would it worsen inflation like Peter fears?
First of all, shout out to the Ghostbusters. Thank you for all that you do, keeping us safe. I'm not concerned that it would cause inflation, and the reason is that if you are, so the way that I've heard this is that the plan would be to take some of the money that they save and take some percentage of that and just give it back to people. Okay, so the reason that I'm not concerned that this would cause inflation is that you're basically reducing spending in one area and then you're giving it to other and then you're giving it to other people. So you're just changing who is spending the money. So typically when you send out checks to people, the reason that can create inflation is either you're doing this holding everything else constant. So you go borrow some money and then you use the money that you generate to send everybody checks.
Or you just print more money.
Right. And, you borrow that money and then the Fed buys it, buys the debt in effect, you've just printed the money, in which case, yes, that causes inflation. But here, I think that you're reducing, this is money that was going to be spent by the government. It's now not going to be spent by the government. And so if you send some of that to um, households, that yes, they're going to spend money, but like the total amount of spending is not really going to change. It's who's doing the spending that's going to change.
There's a lot on Doge and stuff that people want to get to. I'm going to go in some order, but I'm going to jump around and try to stay on topics a little bit. The last time we talked, you dove into tariffs a lot. People really enjoyed that conversation because it's a topic that can be a little confusing to people who don't keep up with that kind of thing on the daily. Um, Same Reb says he says he has some discussion ideas that he'd like for us to talk about. One is discussion of tariffs and the risk reward and balancing along with tax cuts and cuts of spending in general. He wants to know your thoughts on interest rate cuts in the face of massive inflation caused over the last few years, along with the possibility of or tariffs. Maybe he meant more tariffs. I'm not sure he says or, but I'm wondering if he means more. Thoughts on if we actually get a BTC reserve and if you agree that it would more than help in payment of the national debt. So there's a lot there.
Okay, so first of all, on tariffs, I think like the main issue is that most of the tariffs that are going to be announced, they might get implemented, but most of them are not going to be very long term.
Most of them are negotiating ploys
Right.
to strong arm. Like, hey, you're going to have to come to the table here.
Yeah. And the reason that this works for the United States is we just have advantages that other countries don't have. So, for example, we are the end consumer for a lot of other for a lot of producers in other countries around the world. We're like the end consumer for those people, right? The United States is a huge market. Consumption is a big percentage of GDP. So we, as consumers, we spend a lot, which means that we actually have market power. Their ability to pass on the cost of the tariffs to us is difficult. And then at the same time, because we also have the global reserve currency, if prices do go up and we stop buying, then we'll cut back on buying some of these goods. But that means there's fewer dollars flowing overseas, which creates an excess demand for dollars, which makes the dollar stronger. And so as the dollar gets stronger, yes, the good costs more in terms of the foreign currency, but the dollar buys more of the foreign currency, and those at least partially offset one another. So the reason that we're actually able to impose a lot of costs in ways that other people aren't is because we have those two characteristics, and those two things really help us to impose at least some, if not most, of the cost onto our trading partners. Now, of course, they don't want to bear those costs. And so because they don't want to bear those costs, threatening those tariffs or actually implementing those tariffs if they call your bluff is a good way to get them to the negotiation table and get them thinking, and then get them thinking about what they need to be offering you to try to prevent these tariffs from actually going into place or becoming permanent. With regards to like thinking about tax policy, I mean, one of the things about this is that there is an opportunity to kind of rethink tax policy, because given the United States' position in the world, if we can impose, if most of the costs are going to be borne by foreign producers for the tariffs that we're levying, then we can actually generate revenue in effect from those foreign producers. So that means we can generate revenue from people who don't live in the United States. Okay, so that gives us additional revenue without affecting our tax burden. Now, to the extent that we can do that, if we can raise a sufficient amount of revenue from tariffs, then we could potentially lower income taxes and things like that. And so shifting some of our tax burden from U.S. citizens towards foreign producers. And so there is a possibility to kind of rethink the tax system and to rethink whether we want to balance this out more. We have very, very low tariffs compared to the rest of the world. And so I don't think that it's that much of a, I don't think it's that crazy to think that maybe we would want to rethink our trade policy to have some level of tariffs if we could trade that off against, lower income taxes. Sorry.
That's okay. We can come back to that in a minute because I'm going to jump around a little.
Yeah.
I want to get back into the Doge thing.
Yeah.
Elon Musk was at the first big cabinet meeting today, which is an odd thing to watch because they have all the media in there at first, and it becomes this glorified press conference. And CNN said they thought there was a lot of tension in the room directed at Musk, and maybe there was. I wasn't there. HYDR 2005 says, please give us an honest assessment on the aggressiveness of Doge cost-cutting analysis. Do you think the Elon-Doge combo is overstepping at all? This is a question that's being asked a lot. He says, I'm all about efficiency and voted for this leadership, but it seems as if there's a point this could go too far and be blocked in the courts, resulting in the whole thing being a waste of time. Maybe better put, should some of this rhetoric be toned down a bit? I have a feeling I know your answer here.
Well, so there's a couple of issues. So one is about action, and one is about how you talk about what you're doing. So in terms of what they're doing, first of all, I think that to do this effectively, you're actually going to have to make cuts that subsequently have to be reversed. And what I mean by that is that, like, if you're going to go into these agencies, what you really need to be doing is you need to be identifying like the people who do a good job, people who are trustworthy, people who are nonpartisan, people who are not, the impediments to things getting done and things like that. But those people might have to also be let go, and so you might need to just kind of get rid of a bunch of people. But some of those people you let go, you might want to bring back. And this is actually like I think the best analogy for this is to think about corporate takeovers. So in a corporate takeover, most of the time the attitude is like, when somebody comes in and they're going to take over this large company and they're going to try to cut costs in an attempt to save the company, because the reason they got taken over is because of their bloated costs. What you typically do is you go through and you actually get rid of more people than, like, if you sat down and just calculated exactly how many people you would get rid of. You actually come in and get rid of more people than that. And part of the reason is that you're trying to save on time. So you're trying to figure out, because you will find out when you cut too many people, because when you cut too many people, then what happens is you realize, oh, there's certain things that aren't being done. So we got to bring in people to do those things. And so you either hire new people or you bring in people who are experienced and know what they're doing. And then they can actually just come back and fix the problems. But this is just the way that those things are typically done. I think that the degree to which the federal bureaucracy works against the interests of the party in power suggests that we actually need these deeper cuts, because even if like some good people end up being let go, like the people who come in and replace those people when they need to be replaced are going to have a different attitude about what this job actually is than the people who were there before. There is a significant rot inside our federal bureaucracy where there's too many people working in the federal bureaucracy. There are too many people who have their own agendas working in the federal bureaucracy. There are too many people who spend time gumming up the works of what, when they're told to do things that they don't want to do, even though they work at, they work for the president. Like, they can choose to just not do what the president wants them to do or what the stated policy of the president is. So when it comes to those people, you've got to clear that out. We're also just spending way too much money on stupid things. And a lot of this money, as we've seen, is also flowing out, and it's going to places where it's really just like, this is literally just political patronage. They're just giving money to some non-government organization run by their friends, who then turns around and gives that money to other organizations that are also run by their friends and full of, people who are employed who are also politically their friends. And that kind of stuff has to stop. Like, we cannot afford to have that. And so in terms of what he's doing, like, there's not really another way to go about it. Like, you have to go in and you have to cut, and you have to cut quickly, and you have to, and at some point there's going to be pain involved there, because at some point you're going to cut too much, and then something's not going to get done, and then you're going to have to bring in more people.
Unintended consequences.
Right.
And, yeah.
But the thing is like, if you don't do that now, it's never going to get done. Presidents have been trying to do this for decades, for a variety of reasons, just because the bureaucracy is big, the bureaucracy is expensive, the bureaucracy fights with them, the bureaucracy stops them from doing what they're trying to do, even though they're the ones who are elected and not the bureaucrats. And so people have been trying to do this. And so this is really, I think, the only way that you can do it. Now, legally, yeah, there's going to be legal challenges to this stuff. Some of those legal challenges are going to be frivolous. Some of them are just going to be to try to stop them from doing what they're doing, in the hopes that they just get a favorable judge who can delay this stuff, or who can just put it off long enough that they just aren't able to do it, and you're like 2 or 3 years into the administration and you're just kind of like, forget it, we don't have time to do this anymore or something. That's, I think, a lot of what is going on. But there will be like legitimate legal challenges, but we are about to get some clarity on things, because the thing is there is this weird narrative in the media, and there's this weird narrative on the left that all of this, that you can't do any of this stuff, that this is just not permissible, and we have this really, really important question that we need answered, and it's only going to get answered by the courts, and in probably most cases the important things are going to only get answered by the Supreme Court. And that is, who do the bureaucrats work for, and what power does the president have? So if these are all executive agencies, then they belong to the executive branch. So conceivably, these agencies and the people who work in these agencies should report to the president. And so if the president decides we need to get rid of this, or we need to get rid of that, or we need to do this, or we need to do that, they should be carrying out those orders. And we need to have clarity on whether or not that's actually true, because all of these laws that have kind of been passed over the years, Congress and the courts have really interpreted these things as providing protections for the federal bureaucracy, and preventing, people from doing political patronage, like just putting their political friends in these agencies during their terms. The problem is like, none of those laws have actually worked. Like, in fact, all those laws have done is they've created a system where you just have this permanent left-leaning bureaucracy that fights every Republican president.
The quote deep state.
Right.
Yeah.
And that can't be the case. It just simply can't be the case.
Yeah.
And so the question is, and then there's also another important question. An important question is regarding impoundment. So prior to Richard Nixon, presidents had the power to impound spending. And what that meant is that Congress could authorize spending. But if that spending was to be done by these executive agencies, the president of the United States could actually say, no, we're not going to spend that money. Yes, you allocated that money to be spent, but we're not going to spend it. And that was the case until Nixon. And then after Nixon, we had all of these reforms that piggybacked on all of the controversy surrounding Watergate that prevented presidents from doing those sorts of things. But there's a question about whether or not you can really prevent the president from impounding some of this spending. So I think these are important questions we're actually going to need clarity on, because if the president doesn't have the power to actually get rid of bureaucrats, if the president doesn't have power to shut down agencies that are in the executive branch, then who does? Where does the power reside? If he can't do that, then we effectively have a fourth branch of government, which is the federal bureaucracy. And that fourth branch is not accountable to anyone. And so that's a potential problem.
And would be untouchable in that scenario, basically.
Right.
All right. Little political question here. This is a good one. During the election cycle, the campaign, when Trump said, hey, he was for no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime. Pretty quickly, the Harris campaign, smartly, came out and said, oh, we're for that too. It's a great idea. All right, this is something we've been talking about for a long time, and everybody was kind of in agreement. It becomes proposed legislation, and Democrats unanimously voted against no tax on tips or overtime. What do you make of that? Is that just pure political theater, or is that a party that hasn't really understood what happened in November?
Well, I guess that I guess there's a question about whether this is principled or political. I mean, I do think there are concerns about doing no tax on tips. And so one of the concerns about doing no tax on tips is like, if you're going to remove taxes from tips, one way that employers might respond is that if you are working in a service industry, you might just allow your workers to earn some of their income through tips, even if it's not like a traditional tipping business. Like we're already seeing, we've already
Isn't it
seen.
already that way?
I mean,
though?
we've already seen the proliferation of the tipping,
Yes,
right? Where
everywhere.
everywhere you go to places where you would never tip somebody. You've never done this in like since the beginning of time. But now they have like a little iPad where you pay them, and then when you go to pay them, it's like, oh, how much would you like to leave for a tip? And you're
Yes.
like, I didn't know this like was a option.
You didn't do anything.
Yeah. And so, and so I think actually like what my favorite thing ever is, there's an airport. I can't remember what the airport is, but there's an airport that has a self-checkout. And actually when you go to the self-checkout, it asks you if you want to leave a tip. And I was trying to figure out like, if I put like 15%, does that mean I get a 15% discount? Like, are they going to give that back to me? Because I'm the one who's working. Like, I'm the one. But anyway, so but I think there could be principled objections in the sense that this could have unintended consequences. But it also could just, but it also could be that, they want to take the other side and they don't want to give, because let's face it, it's not really politically profitable for them to vote yes, because if this legislation went through, even if they're for it, or even if they would have been for it if Harris would have won, Trump is going to get the credit for it. And so if they're voting for something that Trump gets the credit for, well, of course they don't want to do they don't want to do that.
And that's where people get tired of politics, right there. Because they'd rather have a debate about whether this is a good thing. And if it is, then let's do it. It's back to the Doge thing, really. I mean, what people are outraged at, I mean, I hear people that live in my house, when they hear this about Social Security benefits being paid to people who are 135 years old, that's a little fishy. And if there's an explanation for that, explain it. Maybe it's a coding thing. That's one of the explanations that's been given, is there's a default code that you enter if you don't know the birth date or whatnot.
Can I tell you my favorite response to this?
Yes.
So my favorite response that I heard was that actually this, you think that this is fraud, but it's not fraud. What it is that illegal immigrants can't get Social Security numbers, so they just recycle old ones. And it's like, but that is itself fraud.
That is fraud.
that is fraud.
Yeah, the immigration thing, Trump appears to be trying to do exactly what he said he was going to try to do. Now, he's only been in office for a month and 6 days, so it's not a ton of time into his term. Nowhere close to the first 100 days, but everybody always talks about. He's probably a third of the way through the first 100 days. But he said he's doing the very things that he said he was going to try to do as it pertains to that. And when people push back as if he's overstepping, well, he's doing precisely what he said he was going to do. And a lot of the stuff kind of jumping around a little, in my opinion, a lot of the stuff with Musk is letting Musk be sort of the guy that absorbs the barbs, which Musk doesn't seem to care. He's got more money than God. And it doesn't matter to him. This is like a little fun sport, I think, for him. And he doesn't care if he accumulates enemies. He's not running for election. But I don't know. To me, so far, whether you like it or not, Trump seems to be the guy that is saying, these are the things that I campaigned on. These are the things that the people said they wanted. And these are the things that I'm going to do, which in many ways politically is refreshing.
Well, I mean, what we're seeing is like, I think this is without a doubt, like the first Republican president that we've had in an extremely long time that's actually doing things. you know, most most of the time we're getting people who come in promising to do lots of things and then they get in office and they don't do those things. And like here, like they're actually trying to do all of the things. And yeah, they're moving fast. And yeah, they are, there are going to be like legal hurdles to these things. Yes, there's going to be pushback at some point. Yes, something is going to get messed up at some point because you're moving so quickly. But the thing is that they're actually doing the things that they were elected to do. And I think like a lot of this stuff with Musk is there's a very, very clear strategy. There's a very, very clear strategy, like big, bold strategy. But in terms of how to actually implement this strategy, things are getting muddled. So the strategy on the left and the strategy in the media seems to be that the way to stop this from stop all of this stuff from happening is that you drive a wedge between Trump and Musk. You try to create a rivalry between them, or you
Right.
try to. But the issue is that the media is very, very clearly doing this. You can tell by like the narratives that they put out, like they all just
Like-
start talking about the same things.
Like, is it a co-presidency?
Yeah.
That's very clearly an attempt to get at Trump's ego.
But the problem is like they're screwing this up because they can't, like there's two competing narratives. The one narrative is that like Elon is doing really bad things and this is going to make Trump look bad. And so, like it seems like the criticism of Elon is just dialed up to the maximum, like such that, maybe if this gets so, maybe if this criticism gets so bad that Trump will just get tired of them constantly complaining about him and he'll just tell him to go away. But then on the other side, the other way that they're trying to drive this wedge is, they're trying to be like, oh, well, which one is the president? Is Trump the president or is Elon the president? Now, so part of the problem is like this hasn't been effective so far, but part of the reason it hasn't been effective is because they can't figure out which narrative they're going to go with. And so they're constantly seem to be going back and forth between these. But then the other thing is they're not taking into account the fact that like, the other side also has a strategy. So like conceivably, Donald Trump and Elon Musk knew that these would be strategies that they would use against them. And so they're prepared for this narrative when it comes. And so it's not effective in the way that the media anticipates that it's going to be.
I think that's the clear difference in this Trump term to the first Trump term is the word prepared.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about this before. In his first term, I don't think he was prepared. I don't think he surrounded himself with enough of his people. I don't think he expected to win. Then you had the Russia thing, and that was just this constant distraction that clearly worked. It distracted him. It led to impeachment proceedings, all that stuff. And this time around, he has his people. He was prepared. Again, you can disagree with his policy, but what I don't think is debatable is that he has surrounded himself with like-minded people who are, at least at the surface level, intending to do what he wants done. He has a strategy, a preparation. He knows what to expect. And so he's able to be more efficient, for lack of a better term. I mean, he's gotten a lot of things done in 30 some odd days that I don't think in 2017, when he was inaugurated the first time, I don't think he was able to get anywhere close to this amount of things moving. It's just my observation of it.
Well, and if you think about it, like the big selling point that people like that you would hear just average Americans talk about back in 2017 is they would go, to the diners or whatever and ask like, why are you voting for Donald Trump? And like the typical supporter of Trump would say something like, oh, I want him to like operate the government like a business, right? So like he's a businessman. He'll probably operate the government like a business. And the first time around, like there were elements of that were true, but I think they found out the hard way that the way the federal government operates is so detached from the way that a business operates. And not only that, but that like there are people fighting against you from within to stop you from doing things on a level that most people don't understand. I think that left them, constantly on their back foot. Whereas this time around, they knew exactly what they were getting into. And I think that is one of the reasons why, he has Elon in charge of this thing is it's basically like, look, we're going to have to do this. We're going to have to do this quickly. We're going to need somebody who can come in and like lead a team of people who can go through this stuff quickly, who can evaluate this stuff, who has experience doing this stuff. I mean, they're going in and like they are literally doing it like a business. They're going in and this is just like a corporate takeover. They're going in, they're cleaning house and restructuring things the way that you would in the business world.
All right, Nito Pluto, just a completely different topic. He says, wants to get your thoughts on the future of the nuclear energy sector. Says, sounds like we may be on the way towards a nuclear energy renaissance. He apologizes ahead of time and says he understands that this isn't our area of expertise. It's not certainly my area of expertise. I have listened to a lot of talk about nuclear energy, and my observation from, or my conclusion, I guess, very preliminary conclusion from listening to informed people is that this is a route we should be pursuing diligently as a country as it pertains to our energy policies.
Well, and this is one of this is one of the fundamental problems. Is it's about efficient creation. It's about the efficient use of resources, right? So if you are if you're trying to generate electricity, you want to take the energy that you have and you want like to generate as much electricity as possible from that energy source, right? You don't want to lose some amount of that energy in the correction in the creation of that electricity. So the thing is that when we think about energy sources, things like oil and natural gas are extremely efficient sources of electricity and of heat and all these kinds of things, right? The nuclear power is the best form of energy that we have. This is the most efficient way that we can provide energy, right? This is if you think that artificial intelligence is going to be a thing and you think it's going to use as much electricity as people claim, we are going to need nuclear energy because we are going to need a lot more capacity, and we're going to need to be doing things as efficiently as possible. And so the reason that we need nuclear energy is we need something that's efficient. We're going forward thinking about our future. Nuclear energy is also cleaner than a lot of other forms of energy, which, so that should make the environmental people happy. For some reason, like the environmentalists like are opposed to nuclear energy, which I've never really understood because it's simultaneously efficient and clean. I mean, I guess the objection has to do with like nuclear waste or like or potential like nuclear catastrophes. But the thing is,
seems to be what they claim, and it doesn't come across as genuine. Because what it seems to me, and maybe this is my political bent factoring into this, is that if you went down the road of nuclear energy as effectively, it basically puts the kibosh on the whole electric EVs and things of that nature that are, look, you can debate how friendly they are to the environment, and that's another conversation. But what they aren't is efficient, at least not to this point, right? To where they can be widely used, to where trucks can use them, to where planes can use them, etc. It seems to me that that's more agenda driven than anything else.
Well, but I mean, even if you believe that like electric vehicles are important, or you want to encourage electric vehicles, like if everybody's going to start driving electric vehicles, we're also going to need a lot more electricity. And one of the reasons we're going to need a lot more electricity is like the thing that people don't think about is that the way our electrical grid is designed is that I don't know, like in your neighborhood, right? You've got these little like electrical boxes, right? And so when you drive by those electrical boxes, the thing is that during the day, when people are consuming lots and lots of electricity, those things get really, really hot. And they get really, really hot at nighttime. Substantially less electricity that's being used. What happens is like those components are all allowed, they're able to cool down, right? And so they're able to cool down. And so, yes, they're running at a hot temperature, but then they cool off. Then the next day that, they run at a hot temperature, they cool off. But so that extends the life cycle of these components, right? If you have electric vehicles, when are people going to charge their vehicles? Probably while they're sleeping.
Yes.
Which means
Would
that
make
these
sense.
components are going to be hot during the day when people are using electricity. Then at night, they plug in their cars and that thing stays hot. So what happens to that is those components aren't going to last. Those things are going to catch on fire. Like, you see this in your neighborhood, right? Like you like an electrical box will just catch on fire. It gets too hot and there's like a little explosion. Everybody's power goes out. The electric company comes out. They replace the parts. We go back to normal. With electric vehicles, people are going to be charging these things at night. Those components are never going to get a chance to cool down. That's going to make it much more likely that's going to shorten their lifespan. They're going to have to be replaced much more often. And so that's going to be that in and of itself is going to be extremely costly. But then the other thing is that what that also tells us is that there's just a lot more demand for electricity, because electricity demand is going to be higher all throughout the day, because no longer at night when people are sleeping is their demand for electricity going down. Actually, now there's this new source of demand for electricity while they sleep, which is their vehicle. And so you're going to need more. You're going to need more capacity on your electrical grid. Well, how are you going to create that additional capacity? You're going to need things like nuclear power. You want efficient sources of energy, and so you want to have efficient sources of energy like nuclear, because think about it. You can build as many windmills as you want. You can put up as many solar panels as you want. But you know what? The sun, I'll tell you when I know that the sun never shines at night. Okay. When I'm sleeping, the sun is down. So those solar panels aren't generating any electricity for that EV. There are some times, when you're asleep and the wind blows really hard. There's a lot of times when you're asleep when the wind's hardly blowing. So what's going to charge your car if that's what you're relying on? So you can't use these intermittent sources of energy because we don't have ways to store that energy. Like, that electricity is being generated, but if nobody's using it, you're just wasting that electricity because nobody can actually use the electricity that's being generated. So if the wind is blowing but nobody's turning their light switch on, well, that's not doing anything. And if everybody wants to turn their light switch on and the wind isn't blowing, well, then that's a problem because nobody's lights are going to come on. So we have to be moving towards more efficient sources of energy. So we need to be moving more towards things like natural gas, more towards things like nuclear, and especially if we're going to have electric cars, especially if we're going to have artificial intelligence and all of these server farms that are going to be required to operate these things. We're going to need much more electrical capacity, and the only way that we're going to be able to do that efficiently is through nuclear power.
Tupelo Reb congratulates both of us on the Cubs winning the NL Central this year, making the World Series. I regret to report that we are losing our first spring training game right now to the Giants 4-1. I was just checking. We've been undefeated in Arizona up until today. Maybe we'll come back and beat the Giants in the Cactus League and remain undefeated. He also wants to know, what point in your life did you decide you wanted to get into economics?
It was during undergrad. So I started out as a history major. I don't really know why. I was a history major. I just liked history.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to learn about it. So I don't know. My story about college is I essentially had no plan. I mean, I had no plan. I think I've said this before. Like, I mean, I was the first person in my family to graduate from college, and I didn't know a lot of people who had even gone to college. Like most of the people, like I grew up in a very blue collar neighborhood, like
In Ohio, correct?
Yeah, most of the people had good jobs, but they worked in a factory, or they were like a fireman, or whatever. So like so when I went to college, I was kind of like, I don't know what I'm going to do. And I thought maybe like
your dad built roofs.
That was my grandfather.
Okay.
So my dad. Okay, so my dad after high school, he got a job working for this company, and he basically worked in the warehouse. And like when he started, he was just kind of like a warehouse. He's just a warehouse worker, just bottom of the totem pole. And then he kind of worked his way up, such that like when I was relatively young, he was like in charge of the warehouse. And then from there, he ended up, so it was like a big like wholesaler that he worked for. And then from there, after he had like run the warehouse, they offered him a job to like move into a more sort of white collar job. So then they made him like a salesman for the wholesaler. So, but like that was the thing. My dad worked like the same place like his entire life, like 40 years, like at the same place. And yeah, and I mean, my parents really wanted me to go to college. Everybody told me I should go to college. My teachers, all that kind of stuff. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I kind of was like, well, I need to go to college. So I picked history as my major. And I think the reason I picked history is I was interested in it, but I also kind of figured, okay, well, if I just get a degree in history, even if I haven't figured out what I want to do with my life, like I can just go teach like high school history or something and coach baseball or basketball or something. And that,
Yeah.
and so that, that seemed attractive. And then basically what happened is like, I think about midway through my undergrad, like I discovered, well, I had to take econ as a history major. And I just happened to have like a couple of really good professors and who made it sound really interesting. But also it seemed like, a lot of the things that I'm interested in, they're talking about in economics, but also economics seems to provide like a framework for sort of thinking about all of these things in a way that's much more sort of systematic. And so basically a lot of the things that interested me about history, I kind of realized I could learn about those things from a completely different perspective by studying economics. And so essentially I ended up just going and I ended up having like an undeclared minor in economics. So I just started taking a bunch of econ classes, but I was already so far into the program that I didn't want to change. But the place I was at, they had a master's program that you could do in a year.
This was where?
At the University of Toledo. So we had a master's program that you could do in a year. It was like, it was an intensive master's program. But you could do it in a year. And so I was kind of like, okay, well, I kind of like this stuff. I can do this in a year. I'd be way more marketable on the job market, right, with a master's than a bachelor's. So like, I'm just going to stick around. I'm going to do the year of the master's, and that's what I did. And then I ended up going to, then I ended up going on to get a PhD, and all, the rest is history. But yeah, I just kind of stumbled into it actually. Like I didn't know, but the funny thing about this though is that my parents moved a few years ago, and my mom was like cleaning out the attic. And she found like a box, and it just had a bunch of old like school stuff in it. And there was a thing from when I was in like 3rd or 4th grade. And it was like one of those like little quizzes that you do where like you answer questions and then you get to the end and it tells you like what job you should do.
Yeah.
And mine at the end said economics/finance. That's what it said. And so first of all, kudos to the people who wrote that quiz, right? Like they were on top of things.
Yeah.
But the funny thing about this is I actually remember doing this. I didn't remember until my mom said it to me. But then but then I remembered this, but I also remembered that when I got to the end and it said economics/finance, I literally thought to myself as like 3rd or 4th grade, I was like, I don't even know what that is. And and like, that was it. Yeah.
That's funny. All right. I don't even know what this question means, but I'm going to assume that this person is smarter than me and that you will get it. And if not, we'll move on. He says, is the stagnation of the economy the result of fear or just short-term pain for long-term gain because of Trump policies?
Well, I think the issue is that we've got a couple of problems in the United States, which is, number one, to some extent, you become victims of your own success. Like you can't. So, for example, when countries first start to grow, they tend to grow faster than later on, and part of that is just like you can't grow at like 8% forever or something, right? That so so countries that have experienced like really really rapid growth, it looks like something dramatically changed, but when you look at their trajectories, like South Korea is a prime example. Like they had this sort of amazing period of growth, and then they just kind of have become just like everybody else. But the reason they had that amazing level of growth was because they were just catching up to the rest of the world. So you're able to actually grow a lot faster. As you kind of develop, you grow more slowly. I mean, one of the other problems that the United States has is shifting from a manufacturing based economy to a service based economy. Like service based economies just don't. There's not as much innovation in service as there is in things like manufacturing. Like manufacturing, you're always trying to produce more stuff with the same amount of resources. In a lot of services, it's not clear how you would do that, right? Like, how would a lawyer produce more in the same amount of time? Like just like taking on more cases. Like that's not, you know what I mean? There's not
Right.
a way that you can innovate. Now, there are technological innovations. So I mean, things like computers made lawyers more productive, right? AI can potentially make them more productive. All of these kinds of things, but manufacturing just historically is just a much better source of productivity, and productivity is ultimately the source of economic growth. And so, as you kind of shift away from manufacturing, you're going to get less economic growth. One concern that people have about these cuts that Trump and Elon are making is that if you start cutting government spending, then you're going to have less spending in the economy without anything to replace it, which can create a temporary drag on the economy. Now, the hope is that by doing that, you make the government like a lot more efficient. You're minimizing what economists would call deadweight loss, which is opportunities for trade that don't take place just because something is stopping them from taking place. So you can think of like taxes, government regulation, inefficient bureaucracy, those kinds of things. To the extent that these cuts reduce that deadweight loss, then you're going to get a lot more economic activity. So you would trade short run costs for long run benefits. But I think that's probably two. I guess that's probably two of the main things that I would focus on to address that.
Delay 242 wants, he says he listened to the previous pod, would love a more in-depth breakdown of your opinion of Mississippi trying to move to a consumption tax. What do you think is the right way to go? Florida potentially eliminating property taxes, getting rid of federal income tax potential viability. So my guy Delay is sort of like me. Let's cut some taxes.
Yeah, in I think maybe 2022, 2021. I don't remember if it's 2021 or 2022. One of my colleagues and I actually wrote an analysis of the proposal to eliminate the income tax. And the proposal back then that we analyzed essentially showed that by moving away from an income-based tax and funding more things with a sales tax, that you could actually remain revenue neutral, but you would get additional economic activity. And so in general, like unless you have an army, you probably don't really need an income tax. The reason that, a lot of developed countries have income taxes is that they need to finance very, very large scale things like wars and other national emergencies. And so the income tax is necessary because it's a big, important, and significant source of revenue. At the state level, you don't have that. And so you can focus more on efficiency grounds. And so if we're focusing more on efficiency grounds, the reason to support a more consumption-based tax system than a income-based tax system is if you think about how the income-based tax system is working, the income-based tax system, you get taxed on your income, but then if you save money for the future and you earn income on your savings, then you also have to pay taxes on that income. So you're effectively taxing some dollars multiple times. The other thing is that when you have a mixture of an income tax system and a sales tax system, you're taxing the same dollar multiple times, right? Because I earn the dollar, I get taxed. So some of that dollar gets taxed. What's left over, I spend some of that, but some of that gets taxed. I save some of that, but then when I earn interest or returns from investing that money, that I have to pay taxes on that. And so you're sort of double and triple taxing like one individual dollar in people's choices. And so if we're thinking about the state, yes, the state should get rid of its income tax and go towards a more consumption-based tax. The the issue is that you just have to do this smartly. Like you can't just eliminate the income tax and not replace it with anything, because um no, you're not going to lose all of the revenue that you were generating from the sales tax, because the extra income, some of that extra income will be spent, in which case, sales tax revenue will go up, but it's not going to be dollar for dollar.
Right.
And so you just have to make sure that you don't lose too much revenue by eliminating it. So you have to do this in a smart way. You've got to find other sources of revenue to replace what you're going to lose from the income tax. But if you do that, you can still benefit, because the income tax is so inefficient relative to the consumption tax that you can actually have a net gain in economic activity from just replacing one tax with another.
What about the idea? I mean, Trump has taking T.L. Pierce's question here and sort of combining it with what we're talking about. Trump talked about abolishing federal income tax. He's talked about a consumption tax, I think. He's talked about abolishing it in favor of tariffs. He's the External Revenue Service. According to T.L. Pearson, you would know this better than me. You're a history major in economics and stuff. We've had federal income tax since 1913. It's exorbitant now. They've started to audit the IRS. They're cleaning a lot of that out. I don't know anyone who's not for that. Is it conceivable that you could either fundamentally change the U.S. federal income tax process, or that you could eliminate it in its entirety in favor of like a consumption tax or something of that nature?
Not if the government is going to operate the way that it operates. Like if we want to have national defense, if we want to have Medicare, if we want to have Medicaid, if we want to have Social Security, you want to have all of these programs, we can't. We wouldn't be able to do all of that with tariffs. The reason that we were able to finance our government with tariffs, for the century and a half, I guess, of the first century and a half of existence, was essentially that we had a much, much smaller government, right? I mean, predominantly the government wasn't involved in all of these different things. If you wanted to completely eliminate the income tax, we would have to have a much smaller government. We would have to really rethink what the federal government does. But that's not to say that you couldn't have more balance. So it's not to say that you couldn't, by introducing these tariffs, that you couldn't trade off some of the revenue you're getting from the tariffs by lowering income taxes, because you don't mind losing the revenue from the income tax because you're making it up from the tariffs. But the issue is that if we're going to continue to operate the government on the scale that we operate the federal government now, it's not going to be feasible.
Is that what he's trying to do? Scale down the government as a step one towards maybe doing something that would have been viewed as radical 2 years ago?
Well, it's unclear to me if that's the end goal, or if that's what he is saying as a way to sort of negotiate in that direction, right? So Trump likes to say a lot of provocative things, just to kind of stir people up, and then just let it marinate.
The Canada stuff.
Right, and then wait to see how people react to that, and then when they react, then he comes back with a counter proposal. And so maybe what this is that he would prefer to like move to a system that's more balanced, and so he's just going to say, well, maybe we'll just get rid of the income tax completely, and then people will kind of freak out and then come to the table and go, look, we can't get rid of the income tax completely, but maybe we could do some of this, and and lower income tax rates or something. But even if you were going to do that, that's not something that he could achieve. And even if he does, and even if like Vance got elected, I don't know that you could do something that dramatic in, over an 8 or 12 year period. I think it would be very difficult to do. But over the long run, if you wanted to do something like that, I mean, if there was the political will to do something like that, you could move in that direction. It's just, you would have to really, really rethink what governments do. And look, we're going to have to rethink what governments do,
Yeah.
period, because governments are spending way too much money. I think I've mentioned this before. Like, one of the big changes is like, we take it for granted because pretty much anybody who's alive today has never known anything different. But like, this post-war era of government in Western countries is very unprecedented for most of human history. Like, even if we just confine it to like when we have like what we would call a modern state. Okay, so that's like the last like 500 years. Even in that period of time, most of what that modern state has done is provide national defense. That was like the primary thing that the government did, is that you had a standing army that protected you from outside forces, right? All of this other stuff that the government does now, a lot of this stuff is a recent phenomenon. Like, to a large extent, governments have just become huge insurance companies. I mean, think about what Social Security and Medicare are. Like, they're just big, like it's just big government operated insurance, right? Like, oh, well, when you and so we need to actually think about the feasibility of these things, because it's not just, oh, you have this government insurance, right? Or it's that like, how generous is the insurance, right? Like, is it, like, you have to think about those things, and what do we want to provide, and what can we actually afford to provide? Because what we want and what we can afford are often different things.
Yes.
And the problem is that we in the United States for a very long time have been able to get away with, well, we want this. And it's like, well, and if you look at it, you're like, well, based on, if you look at tax revenue or something like that, you look at it and go, well, we really can't afford that. But because of the position that we're in, where, a lot of foreign central banks just sit on our debt, well, we just have all this passive demand for our debt that's out there. And so even though, like, if we look at our revenue, we can't afford it, we've been able to afford it because people are just willing to lend us the money to do it.
Couldn't run your household that way.
No, and that's the thing, is like, that's not going to be sustainable over the long run.
I mean,
so,
if your Carson says, Dad, I want a Lambo, and you say, well, beyond the fact that I think that's insane, we really can't afford that right now. But you go, screw it. What color you want, big boy? Well, there's going to be debt on that that's going to impact you in other areas of the Hendrickson household. I mean, that's pretty basic.
Yep.
And then when your daughter comes around and she says, well, he got one. And you say, well, it's a hell of a good point. We still can't afford it. But you know what? What color do you want? And she gets a Lambo. Now you're in even more debt. That's not manageable.
No, and I think this is the big problem, is that what we have seen in the post-war era is we've seen Western governments essentially just commit themselves to do lots and lots of things under the assumptions that it would cost way less to do than what was originally envisioned, right? Like, they thought, oh, well, given what we think this is going to be, it's going to cost this, and it's cost 2x, 3x what they thought, and so the problem is that by increasing not only the size of government but the scope of government and all the things that it does, at a certain point we're going to have a conversation about, like, okay, what are the things that we really need the government to do, because it can't do all of these things.
Yep.
And even if it's going to do most of these things, it's going to have to do them on a smaller scale. And so we're going to have that conversation at some point.
Cisco Kid, who is otherwise known as Tyler Siskey, wants to know if the governor of Maine has called in yet. She has not. She has not, Tyler.
More importantly, has her advisor called in? Like,
look, fuck you. Okay,
seems to be the more seems to be the person with more to say, I think.
He was not in a good mood. Needed his caffeine fix maybe that morning. Cisco also wants to know, what do you think we'll actually learn from the new JFK files being released when they're finally released? Tyler thinks there's a smoking gun. We're gonna get to the bottom of this. They're gonna name the shooter.
I don't think we're gonna get a smoking gun. I do think that we'll find out more information. I do think that we'll find out potentially interesting things. I don't think that we're going to get a smoking gun. My biggest thing is I want to know what is in these files that prevented them from releasing them for so long. Because it could be just it could be something completely frivolous. Like it could be something that where um they just were denying this and pretending that it was something important when it really wasn't. But for it to go on this long, it suggests that there's something in there they didn't want people to see, and that's
I
what
don't
I'm
think they
interested
want
in.
us to see Lee Harvey Oswald's tax returns. I don't think they want us to see the woman that he was living with in Dallas, who's still alive today. I don't think they want us to see her tax returns. I think you're going to probably see that one or both of them was on CIA payroll. The Oswald behavior, the the way he returned from Russia, immediately found employment, was taken care of, does not at all jive with what someone who wasn't a CIA employee or informant would have been treated. There's something there that, you know, those tax returns supposedly have never been released. They're under lock and key.
Well, and as it relates to the CIA and things like that, I don't know if I've said this on the podcast. I might have told you this before, but I don't, almost certainly not on the podcast. I have a friend who is a professor, and one of his students was a late child, right? So it was a child who was born when his parents were much, much older.
Okay.
And so one time he went out to dinner with this student and the student's dad. And the student's dad was a doctor in New Orleans. And he regularly treated, let's say, gunshot victims in New Orleans who didn't want to go to the hospital.
Okay.
So safe to say the mob. And so this friend of mine just at dinner was just like, do you think the mob was involved in the JFK assassination? And he said that the guy never hesitated and said yes. Now, the reason that that's significant and the reason that relates to the CIA is like also at this point in time, like the CIA was working with the mob on a lot of different things. I mean, one of the big controversies that we now know is true is that the CIA was setting up front companies, and they were, and this because the CIA had to run these off the books operations in the 60s in Southeast Asia, and they were setting up these front companies, and then, and these front companies were essentially selling drugs. And how did they make money? Well, they would get the drugs and they would work with the mob to get them into the United States, and then the mob would sell them. And so that generated revenue for these off the books operations. So we already know that the CIA was working with the mob. So if the mob was involved, that almost certainly would mean that the CIA was involved.
Yeah, because if you listen to people who once worked in the mob, connected to the mob, studied the mob, they'll tell you that the mob taking on an operation like that on their own is not how they operated. It's completely antithetical to the way that the mob operated.
Mm.
The mob didn't conduct a lot of their retribution in the public light. They take somebody out back and cement shoes and bury him in a river. They wouldn't do a high-profile public shooting where there are going to be witnesses. There's going to be people standing around watching the presidential motorcade. That's not what they would do. The only way they would do that is if they were essentially contracted by a much larger organization and given cover. That's what they say. I'm not saying that's what happened, but if the mob carried out a hit on Kennedy, it was almost certainly a sponsored hit. It wasn't Giancana or Trafficana or whoever saying, all right, I'm going to show you, Bobby. based on everything that I've read, and I've read far more about this than I wish I had over the. I mean, I've spent a lot of time reading about the Kennedy assassination because it's fascinating. But if it was a mob hit, and I suspect it was almost certainly a state-sponsored mob hit.
I'm anxious to see what's in it. I don't think I'm very skeptical that we're going to get like closure from the files. But I'm very interested to see what's in the files because I want to see what they've been hiding from us this whole time.
Chauncey wonders if it's the Bushes being painted in a bad light.
I mean, it's possible. Look, but there's enough information out there. Like if you read on Prescott Bush, I mean, there's a lot of bad stuff. Like Prescott Bush was like was helping fund like the Nazis during. I think this was prior to the United States getting involved in the war, but like his investment firm was bankrolling these things, and they knew that they were doing things that they shouldn't be doing because they were running this through other countries, right? So they would, and so there's a lot of stuff in there that's potentially bad for them.
I want to see the RFK files. I want to see the MLK files. Those are every bit as suspicious.
Absolutely.
Just not as high profile because neither one of those men were the president of the United States of America. But they were both very high profile political figures who were just gunned down in a public setting and
also
quite suspicious ways.
One of the things that will be interesting is to see what's in those files relative to like what RFK Jr. has said about his own father's assassination, because I mean he's actually come out and said like Sirhan wasn't the shooter. And like he's not only said that he was not the shooter, he has fingered another person. He has said that like actually it was this bodyguard that was hired like the day of who actually did it, and like he named the guy. And so to me, I know that RFK Jr. is sort of like Trump in the sense that he just like likes to say provocative things, but I don't think that you would say something that specific just to be provocative, right? Like if you're going to say something that specific, my guess is that he has some information that makes him believe that that's true. And so my question would be, what's in those files? And to what extent does it confirm like what he's actually said? Because that he has more information than anybody else does.
Yeah, sure. All right, we're going to run through a few. DKid80 says, will Section 8 housing be deleted?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so.
Irish Reb says, Social Security was enacted 90 years ago when life expectancy in the U.S. was roughly 61 years. The law set the retirement age at 65. Current life expectancy in the U.S. is around 77 years. And the current Social Security retirement age is 67. Social Security makes up roughly 1/5 of our budget. If the retirement age was increased to 70 years, what would be the effect on the budget? Same for 75 years.
This is the most obvious thing that they should do that could fix a lot of the problems with Social Security is they need to adjust the retirement age, taking into account that people's life expectancies have expanded. Because when this is one of the things that I was kind of alluding to earlier, is that when the system was designed, it was designed as like old age insurance, right? It was really supposed to just provide you with like some supplemental income in old age.
Right.
It wasn't meant to sustain you in a prolonged retirement. And so I think that we actually have to just be honest with ourselves and say like, hey, we've got to change things. And actually this should be something that's easier to change, because you don't have to make the change right away. Like you can phase in the change, so that you can say, hey, if you're like 5 years old now, your retirement age is going to be like 70 or 75 or something like that.
But if you're 68,
right,
we're
like
not
going to take it away.
The goalpost on you right here. Right.
But you just take it from a certain age group and then you change it for them. And if they're young enough, then they have plenty of time to prepare. Right. If you haven't even entered the workforce yet, you haven't shaped your expectations on, collecting Social Security in the future.
By the way, the Cubs have come back to tie this game at 4-4. Irish Reb also wants to know, with the Cubbies undefeated thus far in Cactus League play, do you see this team losing at all in 2025? And what is your outlook on the Cub season and any plans to visit Wrigley this summer?
It's probably the first 162 win season we've ever we've ever seen. Um,
Yep.
no, I mean,
The Giants are threatening in the bottom of the ninth. They have men on the corners with one out.
I am. I don't know. The last few years have just beaten me up
Same.
really, really bad to the
Same.
point where I just can't get excited. I think the question is ask me in like on June 15th how excited that I am, and I think by then I will have an idea of how excited I am about the team. I just can't get excited. Like I look at them and I just think like this is not a World Series team.
Yeah.
And the division stinks, so maybe you can win the division.
Yeah.
But you make the playoffs, yeah, who knows? Maybe you can make a run. But I just, it's so hard for me to get excited.
I let my hopes get up on the Alex Bregman thing. And then I immediately tried to do the fan thing when they didn't do it. Like, well, he's not worth $40 million. That would have been stupid. And then, of course, I said to myself, well, it's not my $40 million. I don't care. Give it to him. And then he goes 3 for 3 in the Red Sox the other day and hits a couple balls off the wall. And I'm like, I don't know. And Matt Shaw's got an oblique. He's not going to go to Japan. And I'm like, well, typical. I'm fighting I'm naturally cynical and skeptical. I just am. So I'm fighting the urge to just go negative on them like right off the bat. I'm trying to give them a chance. And yet I know if I give them a chance, they'll do something like win 4 games in a row and I'll be like all in for a couple of weeks and then they'll crush my soul again. I think they'll have to do a lot to get me back in this time. I anticipate passively following, and they'll have to do a lot to get me interested. Like I'm a pretty big NBA fan, and the NBA team that I cheer for is really good. And so they've got my attention now. And I think they'll still be playing at least into late May. And so by the time they finish, hopefully with a big parade, I'll go look at where the Cubs are, about what you're saying, June 10th-ish, 15th-ish. And if they're in it, cool. If they're not, whatevs. I don't think if they have a bad year, it's going to impact me in any real way.
The problem is if they would have signed Bregman, I would be super excited right now.
I would
Like,
too.
I would just
Why
yeah.
is that?
I don't know because if
There's nothing about his numbers that go, oh yes, Alex Bregman, add him to this team, and hey, we're the Dodgers.
Yeah, like they're not one piece away, but like something in my mind is just
I'm the same way.
Well, but I think this is what it is. They don't sign anyone. They don't try to make any big splash. They don't do anything. And so I think it's just we've gotten so used to them just not getting anyone that we're just like literally anyone. Just sign anyone. Anyone good. Just bring them in.
All right, last thing. This is a good one because I think this is a topic that you're interested in. Rebel ACCY, so I guess that means Rebel Accountancy 95, says, is the birth rate decline real? If so, when does this start impacting our economy and the world economy? You're starting more and more to see articles post hyperbole about the plot of the movie Idiocracy, which I've never seen, coming to real life based on perceived notions about what parts of society are reproducing, and I'm desperately hoping they are wrong.
Well, okay. There's a variety of things here. So first of all, yes, it's real. Like fertility rates are down. There are a lot of reasons. There are a lot of reasons for this. I mean, part of it has been cultural reasons. So if you look at pretty much the Western world, there was a huge change in culture, not only in terms of like more women entering the workforce and things like that, but also just in terms of, delaying having children, which oftentimes just results in not having children or having fewer than you would have otherwise. But honestly, as it relates to issues of fertility, there's a problem at the aggregate level, and then there's a problem sort of at a societal level and a sort of community-based level. So at the aggregate level, like one of the mistakes that people make is that people think, I mean, you hear this all the time when you see poor countries, they'll be blamed on like overpopulation, right? They'll say, oh, they just have too many people. Okay, well, the United States has a lot more people today than it did 100 years ago and 200 years ago.
Hmm.
We're also way richer today than we were. So why, that would seem to beg the question, and as to like why does overpopulation only affect these people and not other people? And the answer is that that argument is just wrong. And it's wrong because it assumes that every person is just another mouth to feed. And so the more people that you have, the harder it is to feed those people. With very primitive forms of technology, that is true. But in the modern world, additional humans are not just mouths to feed, they're also additional brains. And those additional brains have ideas. And many of those brains have ideas that wouldn't have been thought of had their brains not existed. And so what ends up happening is that, population growth actually ends up being a significant source of economic growth because you have more people, you have more ideas. The ideas that turn out to work can be life altering for people. And so these things are a really significant source of economic growth. And so when we look at fertility, one of the things that we have to be concerned with is like, well, what happens if we're not growing the population anymore? Where are these ideas going to come from? Like the set of possible ideas that we're going to get is much smaller. And so as the population declines, yeah, we should be very, very concerned that we're not going to grow at the same rate, that we're going to be sacrificing ideas that we don't even that none of us will ever have that would have been had we had more people. But at the more like micro community based level, the issue that we're having, and this is something that I wish more people would talk about, because when we get into discussions like when Trump says we got to bring back manufacturing and we got to do this and we got to do that, everything gets entirely focused on the economics of the manufacturing, right? Like, well, can we really compete? Can it really be cheap enough? How do we get it back here? Like, will tariffs really work? All this stuff. Everything is economics. But one of the things that we really have to think about is that we have a growing disparity in our society between two-parent households and single-parent households. Um, and it should be obvious because, two parents are more than one. And since we live in a society where pretty much, people are expected to work,
Hmm.
two parents tend to have higher incomes than one parent. Um, and the problem here is that this there's a popular narrative out there that what this is that we've just empowered women to go to college and go to work and not have children, and that's why we have so much more single parent households, is because like it's sort of like the woman can do it all herself. That narrative is completely wrong. Like the women who are going to college and getting jobs, they're the ones who are having two parent households, because they can afford a nanny, or they can afford to take a couple years off and go back to work, or what, because they have someone who can provide for them. Um, in the event that they can't go to work, or when they have two incomes, they can afford to have somebody watch the kids. They can afford to send them to better schools because they have more income. All of these kinds of things. So, like the women who are actually going to college and getting jobs and working full time, those people they're getting married, they're having kids, they're staying married. What you see is that where there's an increase in single motherhood, it's often in these communities where you used to be able to get a good, high paying job with very little skill. So you could go get a factory job, you'd get a decent income, you could work your way up in the factory,
Yeah.
you maybe become, you can maybe
Shift
run the factory
supervisor or
floor.
whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
sure.
And so but you had those opportunities that paid you really well. And what we're actually seeing now is that the destruction of manufacturing has actually destroyed marriage markets in certain places, because these men, who are relatively unskilled, who previously would have gone and worked in manufacturing and earned a decent income, their next best alternative is not comparable at all to the income that you would make in manufacturing. And what that's doing is like the women look at those men and they think they're not marriage material. They can't provide for a family. And they might date them. They might even have children with them. But it's not necessarily planned, and it's also not but there's also not really necessarily a plan to marry them, because what are they going to contribute to what are they going to contribute to the relationship? And so what you have is you've got this sort of like missing marriage market. You've got these people who in a previous generation like would have been getting married and raising children together, who now this marriage market is broken down because the women look at these men and go, I'm going to have to support them, or they're not going to contribute much. And that destroys these marriage markets. And what you end up with is when you do end up with children entering into those places, they're in single parent households. And this is worse for the child. Like this is not to
at a clear disadvantage.
Right. And it's not to denigrate like single mothers.
No.
Okay. Like there are great single mothers out there. There are people who were raised by single mothers. They turn out to be wonderful, wonderful people. That's not the point. The point is that you're starting from a disadvantage, regardless of how great your single mom is. And this is the thing that
100%.
And this is the thing that doesn't get talked about, but that needs to be talked about much more, is that, that erosion of manufacturing, it's not just about the economics, right? It's about providing opportunities for people to have the dignity of work, to wake up every morning and have a good job to go to that makes them proud, right? To have jobs for these men that women are then, proud to be married to them, who consider them, marriage material. Those things are incredibly important. And so it's about the dignity of work. It's about it's about healthy marriage markets. It's about raising more kids in multi-parent homes. Look, we're never going to eradicate divorce, right? People are going to get divorced. People are going to be, people are going to raise their kids separately. You're going to have, unplanned things that happen, and that stuff, a lot of that stuff is unavoidable.
Right.
But the stuff where we have made deliberate policy decisions that destroyed manufacturing and in the process destroys marriage markets and led to increases in single parent households, that's been a detriment to our communities and a detriment to those children who start with a disadvantage.
This is something I really want to dive into deeper next time. I really do. I think there's been it's funny when this topic comes up, a lot of people, well-meaning people, attack it from the female perspective, which I get, I understand. Like women go to college, they put career first, they dedicate themselves to their careers in their 20s, late 20s, early 30s. They look up and the bulk of their prime childbearing years are gone, and they've dedicated that energy to Bank of America or whatever, an big accounting firm. I also think there's something about, and I think it's intentional. I do. I don't know. I can't prove it. I think there's been a fundamental effort to destroy young men by those who are kind of anti-family, want people to be dependent on government, want people to just barely get by. The government will give you just enough to sustain. They'll never give you enough for you to thrive, for you to move up. They don't want you to really move out of that station, because if you're dependent on them, you'll vote for them. It's my theory. And so now you have these young men that are dropping out of college. Men drop out of college at a much higher rate than women. Boys are nowhere close to as college ready as girls are. It's across the board. White, black, Hispanic. I mean, this is everything I read. This is systemic. North, south, east, west, everything. Men are more, young males are more, what's the word I'm looking for? Vulnerable to the proliferation of porn. For example, that it's destructive. That didn't exist really a generation ago. Certainly when you and I were growing up. I mean, I've told this silly story. I mean, Neil Fuller lived up the street from me, and he was my age, and his dad had a stack of Playboys, and Neil and I would spend the night there on a Friday night. We knew how to get to the Playboys, but I mean, you weren't spending hours getting on the play with the play. You had like 5 minutes to kind of get a few mental images, right? And it was nothing. You understand my point?
Yeah.
It was different, and I think there's an intentional destruction, and if it's not intentional, it certainly has happened, I think. And fewer males, like you mentioned, they're not their female contemporaries don't view them as a fit partner. They're getting out of college with higher paying jobs, which is great that they're making money out of college. It's wonderful. I have two daughters, but boys are struggling, and so you have fewer marriages early in the 20s that result in children, and I know you feel this way. And yet there's a societal thing, and I do sense a change. There's a societal thing where it's not cool to tell people the single most fulfilling thing you'll ever do in your life is be a dad. Period. And it's not even close. I mean, I've had a pretty decent career. You've had a great career. You know a lot of people. You do a lot of things. I know that the most fulfilling thing in your life is being a dad. Mine, it's not even close. It's like a total blowout. And yet, when you say that to people, there's a lot of pushback. Well, yeah, but there's no but. No, there's no but. It's the most fulfilling thing I ever did. I wish we'd had more. People do you have a life regret? Like, not many. Name one. We had 3. I wish we'd had 4. I wish we'd started earlier. I wish we hadn't waited till I was at the Birmingham Post-Herald. It was an afternoon newspaper. And, there was all these rumblings that it was going to shut down just any day now. And, well, we can't do that because, gosh, if we had a baby and then the paper shut down, well, what would we have been? That was stupid, really, to think about it. We were happy. We wanted to have children. We knew we wanted to have children, but we waited another 2 or 3 years to have a child. And then we had Campbell and we had Caroline. And for whatever reason, I think because the societal norms at the time, we had 2. We stopped. Had this 4-year break before we decided we wanted to have another child. Carson wasn't an accident. That was an intentional, we wanted to have another child. Had we just kept going, and Carson would have been our 4th child instead of our 3rd child. I mean, that's a regret. I do sense that is beginning to shift now in society. People are going, hey, there's nothing like having a family. There's nothing like being a dad. There's nothing like being a mom. That's the most fulfilling thing you'll really ever do. It's more fulfilling than your career. And maybe there's a return of, families staying closer together where parents can help, grandparents can help, that kind of thing. I just kind of sense that a little bit out there, but it still seems like a minority thought where when your parents were growing up, when my parents were growing up, that was a mainstream thought. And not just that again, that was defied any racial or economic boundary. Everybody kind of thought that way. And then things dramatically changed.
Well, we don't let boys be boys anymore, like as children. Like we really don't. I mean, you see this in schools actually, a lot. Like the expectations on young boys in like elementary school is ridiculous. Like boys are rambunctious. Like boys have a lot of energy. Boys like to tinker with things. Boys like
they're gonna break shit.
Boys like to be violent, and I don't mean violent in like a negative way. I just mean like physical, right?
Yeah.
And there used to be an understanding that that's just the way boys are. And I think that we've completely done away with that. Like we have completely just like we try now. If you look at how schools really try to just like sit these boys down and say, sit still, be quiet, do this kind of thing. And like, look, to some extent that we've always done that. Okay.
Here's some ADD drugs.
But now
we're gonna pump you up with pharmaceuticals and fundamentally change the way that you think.
Yes. And now the issue is like, we're not tolerant that that's how boys are. And we assume there must be some external factor that we need to correct to get them in line. And it's like, no, boys and girls are different.
Yes.
And I don't, and like, I always knew this, but like you really realize it as a parent because you just like when you have when you have a boy and a girl, right? Like my boys are very different from my daughter for reasons that have nothing to do with parenting. It's the same parents, it's the same rules, it's the same everything.
Same sperm, same egg, the whole deal, right? Yeah, I mean, the whole thing, yeah.
But they are completely different, and
fundamentally, yes.
And the things that they do. My boys, okay, my boys are 17 and 14. When I leave here and I go home, and we will eat dinner, and when we're all in the kitchen and we're getting ready for dinner, my boys, without a doubt, both of them, probably both of them, at least one of them, is going to come over to me and try to shadow box me or something. This is what they do. They're going to walk out of the room. They're going to jump up. They're going to touch the door frame. And I'm going to say, stop putting your fingerprints on the door frame. And they're going to do it anyway. But this is what they're going to do because this is what boys do. Like that's the way that they are. And my daughter will do none of those things. She has never in her life tried to shadow box me. Never. Okay. There's no, she has never jumped up to touch a door frame ever. If I told her to jump up and touch a door frame, she would look at me like I was insane.
Right.
Like she would just be like, what kind of weird tests are we doing here? Right. They're different. And you have to recognize that they are different. And we are trying to just make these like homogenous robots that are all ready to go. And that's just it. That's actually not that is not the way that we should do things. And we have to actually think about this thing. And as it relates to like this manufacturing problem, the issue here is like, let's be honest. Okay. There's a reason why no one cares about this, and they don't care about it because like the young, single, non-college educated male is the most ignored segment of society. They don't care about these people. Like when you think about the people who have been in charge, the people who are making decisions for decades now, they don't care about that person. They just don't care. I mean, you saw this actually when there were these journalists who used to write these stories, and it became like a meme on Twitter because there would be these people and they like lose their job in like manufacturing, and like this journalist would be like, learn to code, right? Like, oh yeah, just, go be a computer scientist, right? Or just go learn how to like, code. Like, no, like that's not the point, right? Like the point isn't that like you can just go acquire some skill. It's the condescension. It's the looking down on these people like, why don't you just do something with your life when an opportunity that they thought was available to them has been stripped away?
Yes.
And now they're stuck looking for what to do and how to go about their life going forward. And so, yes, it's not surprising that we have this crisis. It's not surprising that, look, it's not surprising that the support from young male voters was overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. It's no shock because those young male voters, this is the flip side of identity politics. You want to play identity politics? Well, there's a large group of men out there, right? Who are
white,
being
black, Hispanic,
exactly
across the board, yep.
who are being excluded from things, and who are being told that they don't matter because they don't have a certain education level, or because that they don't have this particular set of skills or whatever. Like, and they're told constantly to pick yourself up by the bootstraps, right? Well, just work hard, go out there and make something of yourself. While they see these other groups all getting sort of special privileges, and they see them being rewarded for things that they're not being rewarded for. And they look at this and go, well, that's not fair. Right. And, it's the inevitable consequence of this style of politics. It's the inevitable consequence. And I hope that we're starting to reverse these things, because we cannot do this. We can't have this society that just, demonizes an entire segment of people or just ignores an entire segment of people. And we can't overlook these people. This is why, it is, ask yourself why Donald Trump, went up against this blue wall in the Rust Belt and won the entire thing. Okay. It's because he's speaking to these very people that we're talking about and saying, it doesn't have to be this way. You know it. I know it. Let's change it.
Oh, it's incredibly well put. it's I mean, I've speaking of dinner, it's almost time. It's time for you to go and have dinner with your family. You read about in the boom of the automotive industry in suburban Detroit. These men had jobs for Ford or Chrysler or whoever, and they were good jobs. They were steady jobs. They were jobs they took pride in. They made good living. And they made cars. They were proud of the product that they made. They had the ability to buy the product at a cheaper rate, and they bought homes in neighborhoods with their fellow workers. And there was community there. They were married. They had children. The children played together. They went to school together, so they played on, Friday night lights and football, or the local YMCA basketball league, and they got together on Saturdays in the neighborhood and had big, what's the word? Block parties. People brought dishes or whatnot. Maybe they watched the Lions. I don't know, whatever people did, but they were happy. And then when those jobs went away, well, they couldn't afford the mortgages anymore. They got divorced. That whole thing fell apart. And there's really been nothing to replace it in that part of the country. I'm sure that story is told all over the place. But
when I was a kid, the major employer was Jeep, but also there were but also there were General Motors had facilities around us. So a lot of kids that I went to school with, their parents worked for General Motors or they worked for Jeep or something.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started driving and you would drive to your friend's house, there was a really funny thing that you found out would happen. So there were certain people where if you drove a foreign car, the dad wouldn't let you park in the driveway. Like, he literally wouldn't let you park in the driveway. And if you parked in the driveway, he would come outside and be like, park it in the street. And this wasn't like a Buy American thing. It wasn't a Buy American thing. Like, if you went through their house, there was tons of stuff in their house that wasn't necessarily made in the United States.
Of course.
And it actually took me some time to actually realize this, because when I was a kid, I thought it was just like, oh, like it's a Buy American thing. But it took me some time to actually realize what this really was. And that's not what it was. What it was like the people in this city who work in who are working to put food on their table, they work for American companies that produce these cars.
Yep.
And they take a lot of pride in the work that they do and the cars that they make.
Yep.
And they see them as providing for their family. They see them as not just a source of income, but but a source of pride that they're the ones who make these cars that people drive on the road, and that these are reliable, and that these are the ones you want, and that, and that's what it was motivated by. It was motivated by knowing, like, around here, this is what supports our community are these vehicles. And if you don't drive those vehicles, like these other, that's fine, but you're not going to park in my driveway. And you're not going to park in my driveway because you're not, they saw it as like almost a sign of disrespect. Like, we put in all this work, we create these quality things, and you buy something else. And I get that, like, on some level, this is a little bit crazy to not let people park in your driveway and things like that. But on another level, it reflects something much more just important about the world, and that is the dignity of work.
Yes.
And the taking pride in your job. It wasn't so much this is American made. If they worked for Honda, I bet they would have had the same exact policy. If you drove up and you were in a Honda, they would have been like, nope, like, park in the street. But that was the thing, is like, you are expected to take pride in the things that your neighbors produced, just in the same way that those neighbors took pride in the thing that they produced. And that was part of your community. And that was part of being part of that community, was sharing that level of pride and being proud of what you do, and having the dignity of work and getting up every day knowing that you had a purpose and knowing that you were doing something important.
We'll dive into this next time. I think it's a fascinating topic. I really do. I think it's one of the big reasons Trump won. He talked about bringing jobs to America. I think people inherently want to work. I think they want their work to have value. The pressure's on him to get those things done. Obviously, he's busy. He'll be busy next time. I don't know what our schedule is. 2 weeks from now is going to be spring break. I will probably be in Nashville that day for SEC tournament. Josh will probably be somewhere with his family. The week after that is NCAA tournament. I don't obviously know at this moment where Ole Miss will be playing in the NCAA tournament or when. So I guess, or conceivably if, although I do think they're going to make the tournament. So we'll figure it out, and we'll promote and let sure everybody know. Thanks to everybody who asked questions today at rebelgrove.com. Thanks to those of you who are at the stream on MPW Digital. Josh, thanks for the time.
Thanks. Always fun.
That's Josh Hendrickson. I'm Neil McCready. Until next time, take care.